Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about the collapse of the American epoch of oil. Epoch, or as the British might say, epoch, refers to a specific point in time, a significant event or date that marks the beginning of a new era. Significant epochs in history include the Renaissance, which transformed art and learning, or the Industrial Revolution, which transformed economies, or the American and French Revolutions, which transformed political landscapes. Despite desperate efforts by the oil industry and its captive U.S. government, the epoch of oil is drawing to a close. Even if we try to ignore the cheap and more sustainable power provided by wind and solar energy, the world's oil reserves are expected to dry up by 2050, leaving us no choice but to transition to new sources of energy. But most of the world isn't waiting. Over the past decade, clean energy investment has increased tenfold. In 2025, clean energy investment was more than double that of fossil fuels. And renewables have now exceeded coal as the world's top provider of electricity. And that trend continues to grow. With the exception of the United States, Russia, and a few Gulf states dependent upon oil production, the world is rushing to embrace renewable energy. And recent events are accelerating that transition. Russia's invasion of Ukraine led the EU to end its dependency on Russian oil. And the U.S. military actions in Venezuela and Iran have destabilized oil prices, admittedly creating massive windfalls for the oil industry, but also leading to cost shock for the consumers that make cheap, safe renewables ever more attractive. Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, he recently stated that we have entered the age of clean energy, and that those who lead this transition will lead the global economy of the future. You know, many historians will argue that the British Empire ended when coal was replaced by oil, which led to the rise of the oil-rich United States. We can equally argue that the end of oil may lead to the collapse of an oil-obsessed America. Will current U.S. energy policy make America great again, or is it making America go away? We're joined today on Zoom by Jonathan Watts, global environment writer for The Guardian and founder of sumauma.com. Jonathan is an environmental journalist based in the Amazon rainforest. He's the founder of the Rainforest Journalism Fund and the China Environmental Press Awards. Jonathan's most recent book, The Many Lives of James Lovelock, Science, Secrets, and Gaia Theory. Jonathan is a recipient of the 2018 and 2019 Seal Environmental Journalism Award. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Bob. Good to be with you.
Well, you've covered East Asia for The Guardian since 1996, and are one of the world's leading foreign correspondents. What led you to a career in journalism and specifically to focus on China and Japan?
It was a calling that arrived by accident. I was looking for a part-time job when I was a student, and the first opportunity I had was to work as an assistant for a Japanese media organization. At that time, I was in London, so I was working for the correspondent of this newspaper, the Hokkaido Shimbun. And I immediately realized this is what I want to do as a career, because this was a job that gave me a license to be curious and a license to see the world and a license to ask awkward questions to famous people, powerful people, experts. And after that, I never really looked back. And everyone identifies themselves in different ways, through gender or race or 100 other aspects. But for me, when people say, "Who are you?" I'm a journalist. So it's kind of been a profession, but also my life.
Indeed, you are a journalist. What brought you to the Far East? I mean, you're saying at a young age, how'd you find yourself in Japan?
I initially went out there to teach English. I mean, this is a really long time ago, like in the right at the start of the 1990s. But I fell in love with the country and fell in love with my ex-wife. And so I kind of married into the country very happily, have 2 kids who are half Japanese, and then spent most of the next 20 years working first in Tokyo and then later in Beijing and covering all of East Asia for the Guardian newspaper. And just fascinated by the speed at which things worked and also the difference in the way things work, in the sort of challenge it often posed to my assumptions of what is normal because I grew up in London. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British. And so, yeah, it opened my eyes to a different view of history, a different view of economic priorities, a different view of how cultures and societies should be organized. And I love that. I've just never stopped being fascinated by new ideas and challenges to things that I assumed were just universal, but are not. So I think that goes back to this idea of curiosity being a driving force in my life.
Indeed. And in addition to covering East Asia, you've reported on a lot of the major climate summits. I mean, the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, which was COP16, and the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in 2012, and the COP30 in Brazil recently. Comparing the really decades of United Nations climate conferences, what's your sense of the world's progress on climate issues?
Probably like most people who have covered the UN climate conference process for well nigh 2 decades now, it's a mix of extraordinary frustration and also a kind of grudging appreciation that this process is able to move forward at all. The form is obvious. We need to move much faster. The United Nations does not move fast, it moves slowly. So we are facing a crisis where we need to almost make a handbrake turn, but we're just slowly applying the brakes. So that is enraging and sometimes very mortifying to watch that. But on the other hand, the more I'm involved in this, the more I observe this, the more I realize this is the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced by far. The closest comparison is probably the big peace treaties that we've seen throughout history in Versailles and elsewhere. The winners divide up the world and try to rebuild it and remap it in a way that will avoid another conflict. That's the idea, which is challenging enough when it's just three very powerful leaders behind closed doors, as was the case at the end of the Second World War, where you just had Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin just divide up a big chunk of the world. But the climate challenge is so much greater because countries are trying to get together and in a completely open and transparent manner to divvy up the world's remaining carbon space. So that's not a two-dimensional problem that you can do on a map. That's at least 3 dimensions, maybe 4 if you include time. And it's incredibly complicated and involving science as well as politics, economics, psychology. Every aspect of human endeavor, human activity is involved in this challenge. And so it is remarkable that progress has been made. And when I went to my first climate conference in 2008 in Copenhagen, back then, a target of 3 degrees of warming was considered very difficult. We'll never persuade countries to agree to that. But since then, the target went down to 1.5 degrees C at Paris. And if it were not for all of these negotiations, if it were not for the strong signals that this has sent to the business community and the renewables industry and investors, we would be in a far worse position right now than we are. So yes, every day I wish it would move faster, but it is making progress and something to build on. So yeah, it's a front row seat on the most important issue in the world today. So it's been a privilege, even if it sometimes keeps me awake at night.
In a recent essay, you say that the global balance of power is shifting from the declining petrostate in the West to the rising electrostate in the East. Talk to us about petrostate versus electrostate.
So this is the idea that the world is in the midst of another great energy transition, and that every time there is a great energy transition, there is a shift in the balance of power. The energy transition we see right now is one from a world dominated by fossil fuels, in particular gas and oil, to a world where renewable energies like wind and solar provide most of our electricity. And this is well underway. Last year was the first time that renewable energy took over from coal as the leading source of electricity supply. So that was an incredible turning point in history. And that was the moment when you are seeing electrons replace molecules as the form from which humanity gets most of its power. So it's a really striking moment in history where we are reinventing ourselves, reinventing how we power our economies, how we power our lives. And on a global level, you are seeing countries move at different speeds and in different directions in this transition. The majority, led by China, are trying to become electrostates. They're trying to reach net zero. They're trying to power their economies by electricity, which is in turn produced by clean renewables, rather than the old power structure, the old power grid structure of the past, which was predominantly based on fossil fuels, particularly coal, but also oil and gas. So you've got these two poles now in the world between the petrostates, led by the United States, which is by far the world's biggest producer of oil and gas. In fact, the US produces more oil and gas than the next two countries combined. So the US produces more than Saudi Arabia and Russia put together. That's how wedded the US is right now to oil and gas. And then on the other side, and of course, the US has been the dominant power in the world for well nigh a century, and certainly the last 50 years. Then on the other side, you have China, which produces something like 2/3 of the world's wind turbines and solar panels. So and also is leading in electric vehicle production, is also controls the supply of critical minerals, which are essential for renewables. And it is moving very fast to becoming an electrostate. It's still the world's biggest investor in coal as well, but increasingly its new coal is being used as a backup, and the main generating capacity of the country is heading towards renewable energy because it's cheaper now. That's the really big change that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, is that renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels. Even coal, which is the cheaper of fossil fuels, is expensive in many parts of the world compared to solar. The International Energy Agency said that we are now enjoying the cheapest electricity in history, and that's because of solar power. So it's I get quite excited to even thinking about this. I love history. I've always been interested in these big turning points, politics or economics, and we are in the middle of one right now. And it's thrilling. It's also a little alarming, because generally when you have these tectonic shifts in the form of energy that dominates in the world, you also have a shift in the global balance of power. And generally speaking, when there's a shift in the global balance of power, one country doesn't cede its position without a struggle. And so it can often involve a period of turbulence and conflict. And I think that's what we are seeing now.
You noted that the British Empire saw its decline when there was that energy transition away from coal to oil, and the United States being the oil-rich country, that was when their ascendancy began. So we're now seeing this new transition from oil to renewables. And what I'm hearing you saying is that the countries that take the lead on renewable technologies will also become the leaders of the next epoch of human history, human politics, everything that goes with that.
Yes, and as someone who spent 9 years in China as a correspondent, and who I was there from 2003 to 2012, and saw how enthusiastically China embraced renewable technology as a chance to overtake the US and Europe, and it's so connected to their sense of history. And we're seeing, because of this energy transition, we're seeing almost a full circle being completed in which country is the dominant power in the world. So I think we've seen two major transitions since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we're in the midst of a third. So the first big transition was from manpower, essentially, and horsepower in the pre-industrial age, when for about 1,000 years or more, the world's most powerful economies were China and India. In other words, the most popular countries were the most powerful economies because they had the most people, and people power, manpower, was what economies were based on. That was overtaken by the Industrial Revolution, and my country, Britain, which was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, started using coal and was able to power its military, particularly its navy, with coal-powered, well, you would have these coal-powered gunships. And so this tiny country, Britain, relatively speaking, was able to defeat on two occasions China, one of the biggest countries in the world, because it had this new technology, this coal-powered military technology of 200 years ago, near enough. And so that led to these victories in the Opium War. So that was the rise of and the dominance of the British Empire, which was coal-based in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, you saw that start to wane as coal became secondary to oil. And Britain at that time did not have its own oil supply. So it depended on access to Middle Eastern oil supplies. And this was difficult. It's far away. And in 1956, Britain and France, another old imperial power, tried to seize the Suez Canal with Israeli forces in order to have access to oil supplies in the Gulf. They were not successful, and they called on the United States to help them. And the United States said, oh, no, you're on your own this time. And that led to everybody realizing the dominant power in the world right now, certainly in the West, is the United States, which had abundant supplies of its own and had indeed had huge economic growth as a result of the oil fields opened up by Standard Oil, which made Rockefeller one of the richest men in the world, and so forth. Anyway, those were the two big energy transitions of the last 200 years. And now we're in the middle of another, as we've discussed already, from oil and coal and gas, all of the fossil fuels, to renewables. But this is not complete. And that's what's interesting, is that now I believe there is this attempt to prevent this transition from moving ahead and to either stop the clock or even turn back the clock to try to maintain the era of oil and gas and coal.
So how are the various petroleum interests? How are they fighting to stop this transition to electrostate?
They've been fighting for decades. Initially, they fought by promoting denial, by saying climate science is fake, even though their own scientists and their own internal documents showed that they were warned, and their own scientists believed there was a danger from burning fossil fuels, that would warm the planet. So first denial, then when denial was difficult, just doubt as much as possible. So fund scientists for hire, mercenary scientists to spread doubt. Then when that wasn't working so much, then you start to say it's uneconomical to change. It doesn't make sense. We're going to impoverish ourselves. And we're seeing that today, which is another argument that worked for a while, but now makes no sense because renewables are actually cheaper than coal, oil, and gas. So they've lost the moral argument. They've lost the science argument. They are losing the economic argument. And so what we're seeing now, I believe, is a new phase of using disinformation on a massive scale, social media manipulation, and hushing of the climate debate whenever possible, along with a greater use of force, of using the military overseas, or of outlawing protests within countries. Or even in the US, you might say even that the ICE force is almost like it's a paramilitary organization within a country that didn't exist before. And I would say all of these examples can be linked to fossil fuel interests essentially capturing states, particularly the United States. But you could also say Russia, Saudi Arabia, many of the Gulf states have been controlled by petro dictators for a very long time. But it's essentially this industry that feels threatened because of this transition is now using non-democratic means and challenging democracy so that it can maintain control, maintain markets, and maintain profit.
So China's now clearly the world leader on renewable technology, and that's enhancing their position as we move to this new epoch of electrostate. How does that impact social issues that might be raises concerns about China?
I think it's helped to change perceptions of China, which for a very long time was seen in many parts of the world, let's say more in the Northern Hemisphere, I would say, but particularly in Europe and North America, as a country that was not democratic. It's that had a pretty bad human rights record that arrests dissidents and artists and lawyers and continues to do that now. And for that reason, its soft power has never matched its hard power. In other words, its ability to persuade, to win hearts and minds, has never been at the same level as its ability to sell cheap goods and be a very attractive business partner. But that is starting to change, not because China's changed, but because, well, it's partly because China's energy structure has changed, but it's also because its main rival, the United States, has changed so much. So the gap in, say, the soft power of the United States and China has narrowed. It's no longer seen that the United States is a champion of democracy and freedom, at least not in many parts of Europe. It's not seen that way anymore. Whereas in the past, many countries in Europe, especially the UK, where I'm from, would have definitely felt much closer to the United States than to China. But that really has changed because of what we've seen with the ICE protests and the killings of protesters, but also with the war in Iran and the bombing of children's schools and so on. But also because of this shift in energy geopolitics, because the US administration under Donald Trump has pursued a policy of what they call energy dominance. It's a very old-fashioned, almost colonial way of looking at energy, that you have to control the supply of energy wherever you can, whatever it takes. And even if you use tariffs to bully people, that doesn't work. You use direct military action, as we've seen in Venezuela, which has the biggest oil supplies in the world, and as we've seen, or attempted, as we've seen the US attempt with the case of Iran. So it's a kind of somewhat bullying approach, this idea of energy dominance, one country just basically controlling as many oil taps as it can and using that control to influence and dominate the world. Whereas China is spreading renewable technology, which is good business for China. It has, at least for maybe 5 of the world's top wind turbine manufacturing companies. It also is by far and away the leader when it comes to solar cell manufacture and batteries and so on. But if you think, once you sell a country solar power or wind power, you are giving them a kind of energy autonomy, because they don't need to keep relying on you to keep the taps open all the time. Yes, they'll have to buy more solar panels from time to time, but it's not the same level of dependency. So it's widely accepted that renewable energy is inherently more peaceful than fossil fuel technologies, where you have to worry all the time about supply routes, the Strait of Hormuz as an example, but also having enough US currency to pay endlessly for the next barrel of oil. Leaders from across the world are now heading towards Beijing to talk to Xi Jinping, to try to build relationships, partly to counterbalance the United States, but also because China is now playing such a central role in the energy transition. And as a result, I would say that President Xi Jinping has more authority in the world than any Chinese leader since the Opium Wars of the 19th century. So it's just staggering what we're seeing now. The shift, not just in terms of energy supply, but also the shifts in the geopolitical hierarchy.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Jonathan Watts about the collapse of the American epoch of oil. So, in your work as a journalist, do you see a connection between the petroleum industry and far right political groups?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I think it's been increasingly apparent that big fossil fuel interests, particularly in the United States, are funding right wing think tanks that are in turn promoting discourses against net zero in Europe, and that this is also being happening at the same time that the petrostate of Russia is pushing a far right agenda online using trolls and social media channels to spread disinformation and far right ideologies across Eastern Europe, but in fact all of Europe. And there's been numerous exposés of how Russian banks and Russian business people have been providing the funds for many of these far right groups that we see in Britain, but also in other countries in Europe. So I think it's there. It's also the case that we are seeing a kind of indirect influence through Silicon Valley. The big social media companies for a long time were seen as kind of allies in the climate fight, as that many of them set very high goals when it came to using renewable energy, and their environmental and social governance regulations within the companies were quite ambitious for some time. But in the last 5 years, we've seen a worrying shift as many of these giant companies have almost swapped sides. And it's because of the rise of artificial intelligence, which requires the enormous expansion of data centers. And those data centers are incredibly thirsty for water, but also very hungry for energy. And many of the sort of big Silicon Valley company owners have now started to soften their renewable energy targets and to accept that they need more. They need all sorts of energy, including gas. And so they're kind of somewhat shifting sides. And you're starting to see, well, like Elon Musk, who was once a great promoter of renewables when his main business interest was electric vehicles. He provided the funding for the far right British leader Tommy Robinson. He paid his legal costs on one occasion and has used his platform X to promote far right ideologies regarding racism and anti-migration platforms. So there is this kind of coalition that is supporting the far right that combines petrostates, oil and gas interests, and now worryingly also some powerful elements in Silicon Valley too.
In your writing, you often use the phrase fossil fuel fascism, which I find interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about where that phrase comes from and what it means?
Fossil fuel fascism is a term I coined to try to capture the extreme tactics that the fossil fuel industry are now resorting to in order to maintain their markets and maintain their identity and their existence in a world where they have lost the scientific, moral, and economic battle to renewable. So in the past, they were working with democracies, within democracies, as one of many forces competing for influence in government. But I think it's now observable, particularly in the United States, that these same interests are now coming to the fore much more and grabbing power much more overtly than in the past. And through the politicians that they have been funding and supporting, such as Donald Trump, in particular Donald Trump, they are now using state power in a way that puts their own interests ahead of those of the majority of Americans, the majority of people in the world, against the interests against the environment, against the climate, against truth. And in this way, this is leading to very fascistic behavior. Firstly, because fascism, as it was exhibited in the 1930s in Italy and Germany, relied heavily on propaganda, misinformation. We're seeing a lot of that now. But it also relied on force and the use of force, the use of the military, threat of violence within countries, and also the threat of attacks on other countries. And I think we're increasingly seeing that in the United States. It's not over. There's clearly a lot of institutions, a lot of people fighting against that. The battle is not finished. But if left unchecked, I would be concerned that this trend, these forces, will not allow the public to decide whether the United States moves forward with an energy transition towards renewables or tries to move backwards. My concern will be that now that fossil fuel interests have more power in the United States than they've probably ever had through particularly Donald Trump in the presidency, that they will do everything in their power to maintain that hold. And so I would fear that democratic processes will be eroded in the future in order for this group to prevent the transition in the country that's most important to.
Earlier, you referred to ICE as a new paramilitary organization in the United States. Do you see ICE having a role in fossil fuel fascism?
I think it potentially has a role. We have not seen that yet. We have seen ICE mobilized. Well, firstly, we've seen ICE created almost out of nowhere with an enormous budget and a great deal of hardware, military hardware that they're able to use, and an incredibly free rein to use violent tactics and lock people up. At the moment, that is predominantly directed towards migrants or suspected migrants. However, that same force is potentially a force that could influence elections. There's been talk of them being sent to polling stations as observers, as security, which would put off many voters, of course, who don't want to be intimidated and might feel that that's a high risk. They're not white people. And so I think very easily it could be used to disrupt elections and maintain the current administration in power. We don't know that yet. But let's just say it would facilitate another attempted effort to deny election results that the current administration doesn't like. So that clearly was attempted when Biden beat Trump 6 years ago. And at that time, it was a ragtag group of protesters who stormed the Capitol building. But imagine if they're organized and heavily armed and have some vestige of federal authority as a result of their uniforms and who they get their paychecks from. It would really change things. Then you've got regular police up against them. The situation could yet be very different if that happens again. So, I mean, we're speculating at the moment, but this force never existed before. And it could easily become that kind of force if those who give the orders decide to change its purpose from migration to election control.
How important was the oil industry to Trump's 2024 election?
The oil industry was a very major funder. There was a big meeting at Mar-a-Lago when Donald Trump summoned all of the top executives of the major oil and gas corporations of America. And he told them he wanted huge sums of money for his campaign. And that in return, he said, you'll get this and this and this. Less promotion of electric vehicles, weaker regulations when it comes to emission standards and so on, all the things they wanted. They did provide large amounts of money for his campaign. They continue to provide huge sums for his political action committee, which is supposed to be for re-election, even though He can't stand for re-election according to the Constitution, but there's still money coming in from fossil fuel companies to Trump's election campaign. And in his first year in power of his second term, Donald Trump has filled government with fossil fuel executives and people very sympathetic to their cause. He's, of course, pulled the United States out of the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement again, but actually this time said the United States will leave the whole process. He's made huge number of decrees related to energy dominance, promoting the coal industry, obliging the US military to use more coal, to shut down wind farm projects, to choke funding for battery projects, just at the wrong time for the United States. Last year, electric vehicles overtook petroleum cars in many parts of the world, the sales. And just at this transition moment, Trump is taking away the US's potential to compete in this really crucial area of business. And it's everything that's being done is benefiting the oil and gas industry. Their interests are coming before the interests of the nation, and certainly above the interests of US consumers and US drivers. US oil industry executives made very clear that they've got most of what they've wanted in these nearly 2 years that Trump has been in power.
I'm going to quote you again. You've said, quote, Trump is not just a deranged individual, but a living expression of sulking fossil fuel interests and U.S. failure to adopt to the 21st century. Would you like to expand on that?
This is something that gives me hope, in fact, because often it's too easy to look at Donald Trump as a malignant narcissist or a crazy guy in the White House who is doing all of this just because he's deranged. But in fact, he, to me, represents these much bigger changes that are taking place when it comes to energy and power. And if you look at him in that sense, then you can see he's kind of a symbol or even a manifestation of the frustration, the sulking, a temper tantrum of an entire industry that is losing out and can see itself losing out on argument after argument, science, morality, and economic cost to renewables. As a result, have put this guy in the White House who is an anachronism, who is trying to turn back the clock, trying to return to a 20th century where the US was dominant, even though the rest of the world is trying to move in the other direction, even though the climate crisis, which is worsening every year, demands that this transition takes place. And so, yeah, he's like a King Canute who is trying to hold back the tide. It looks absurd because it is absurd. It's not going to work, but it could be really, really messy. The longer it continues, the more this very, very powerful group of companies who let's face it, in the past, they've contributed enormously to the world and global development, but they had their time. And now we're in a different period, as coal had its time. It doesn't work to just try to pretend that change is not necessary, change is not happening. And it can be very dangerous. And I feel that's what's happening, and that Donald Trump is a manifestation of that rather than just an individual act.
You mentioned earlier about Trump putting a lot of fossil fuel people into the administration. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, former petroleum fracking executive. How is Mr. Wright's energy policy affecting U.S. relationships with Britain, the EU, and groups like the International Energy Agency?
Mr. Wright's approach has been to bully people in Europe through the threat of tariffs to accept increased exports of natural gas from the United States. So to boost the market through semi-intimidation in the form of primarily tariffs, but it's also coincided with a lot of extra talk and threats about possible US seizure of Greenland, which is under Danish sovereignty. So that's one way that he has tried to push the US agenda on Europe. The other way is that he and other members of the Trump administration have been using their influence in international institutions to try to choke the debate about the climate. Any mention of climate change has been frowned upon by the US inside the International Energy Agency. That the US has insisted that they stop mentioning this in their documents and don't have this as an agenda item when it comes to formalized discussions with all of the member countries. So yeah, it's very overt and has put a lot of people's backs up in a great many countries in Europe, which alongside Donald Trump's constant criticism of NATO and has made many people in Europe, even in the UK, which has always considered itself to have a special relationship with the United States, has made many, many people question whether this is still a reliable ally and whether it can be trusted and whether we need to balance our relationships with the outside world a bit more by getting a little closer to China, getting a little closer to India, and just kind of slightly shifting our dependency so that we are not subject to the whims of either an eccentric president or the very powerful fossil fuel interests behind that president.
So Trump's fossil fuel policy, rather than supporting U.S. diplomacy on the world stage, I hear that it's driving former U.S. allies into the arms of other countries like China.
Absolutely. From everything I've seen of what's happening, certainly in Europe, that is very evident. And it's also why the US is very keen for far-right groups in Europe to take power, because then that would change and that they would feel more aligned. And in South America, where I'm currently based, you are seeing that now, that in election after election, far-right candidates are starting to take control. So this goes on. It's not a done deal yet.
So the epic of oil. The end of oil doesn't have to mean the end of the United States. You know, the United States can still embrace and become a world leader in renewable energy. I mean, we were there for a while, and there's no reason we couldn't return to that. How is the world and America specifically fighting back against this fossil fuel fascism?
Well, the United States is, I believe, still the leading nation when it comes to research and development of renewable technologies. So it has a very strong position there, although the longer the current administration has its way, the less likely that is to grow and thrive. But it's there, and it gives the United States a great deal of potential leverage in the future. You have states like California that have invested enormously in wind and solar and get an ever-increasing share of their electricity from those forms of energy. You even get like Texas, which is famous as a home of the oil industry, is now also a center of wind energy. And so you're starting to get balancing even in that state. Then in many parts of the country, judges have blocked the Trump administration's attempt to kill wind projects and other renewable energy projects. So you're seeing a big fight back in the legal system. And I think it's clearly still the Democratic Party is much more on the side of renewables, although it's mixed. Let's face it. I mean, it was the reason the United States is now by far and away the biggest producer of oil and gas is not just because of Donald Trump. It goes back much further. Democrats are conflicted, but they're definitely more sympathetic than Donald Trump and the Republicans right now. And you're seeing people in many states, but particularly, say, recently in Minnesota, who are resisting ICE and trying to fight for democracy. And I think there will be more of that. And then, of course, you've got other countries who are trying to reposition themselves and build new alliances that promote renewables rather than more oil, coal, and gas. Most recently, Colombia hosted a really incredible conference, the first ever conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, when more than 50 countries, high ambition countries, said that they would not just wait for the slowest ship in the convoy, but that they would try to move ahead as fast as possible on phasing out oil, coal, and gas. So there are so many things happening, but the biggest one is just market economics, because solar and wind are now cheaper than oil, coal, and gas. It just makes sense now.
A few years ago, you co-founded a journalism platform named Sumouma. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Sumoma is an Amazon rainforest-based media organization that I founded with my wife in our home of Altamira, which is in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. And the idea is that it's an attempt to break away from traditional media practices. My wife and I are both sort of late career journalists who've spent decades doing the news the way we were taught to do the news. And that's a very kind of industrial way to do the news. Most media organizations were founded at the start of the Industrial Revolution, relied on industrial processes, and put power and money at the center of their priorities, money and capital at the center of their priorities. And what we're trying to do by basing a media organization in a rainforest is trying to shift the perspective so that we center our values on life rather than money on power. So we try to amplify the voices of forest people, such as indigenous communities, and we try to explore a diversity of ways to report what's happening. And sometimes that can be very experimental, such as interviewing trees or looking at hydroelectric dams from the perspective of fish, or using poetry or using comics. And other times it's much more conventional, and it's, old-fashioned investigations of environmental crime.
Your latest book, The Many Lives of James Lovelock. What do you want us to know about Dr. Lovelock?
Dr. Lovelock, Jim, as I came to know him, was one of the most fascinating scientific figures of the 20th century, who was involved in the first discoveries of the threat the fossil fuels posed to the climate. He warned the chief scientific officer of Shell in the 1960s as his advisor. He played an absolutely essential role in the discovery of the ozone hole. He developed the Gaia theory of the world as a living organism. And he also worked for the intelligence agencies on techniques to defuse bombs and to detect explosive materials. So he just had this incredible life. And I think that life gives so many insights into how science has shaped humanity in the past 100 years. Because Jim died when he was 103 on his birthday. And he spent the last 2 years of his life talking to me and uploading his life into my notebook and my recorder. And you can see the conflicting, overlapping, inspiring, but also sometimes stultifying effects of human relationships on science, and also of business interests on science. And I think it's really important we understand this, how influence is welded behind the scenes, and how ideas are shaped. And I think Jim Lovelock is a fantastic example of that, because he was one of the most brilliant human beings of the 20th century. But at another level, he was socially incompetent because he grew up almost alone. And so this meant he was capable of extraordinary inventions, but also sometimes incredibly gullible and manipulatable. And this combination of relationships and how they shape us, I found extraordinarily interesting and useful. Makes me really understand better how we come to believe the things we do as a result of science, and what we're taught by science, and how that science came about.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure to be on your show, Bob. Thank you very much for this invitation.
Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work?
To learn more about what's going on here in the Amazon and what Sumoma is doing, please check out our website, sumoma.com, which is trilingual. So it's in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. I'd love people to read the book as well, because I think relationships and feelings and how they shape science It's really, really important.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. You can read Mr. Watt's article, The American Epic of Oil is Collapsing. What Comes Next Could Be Ugly on The Guardian and on the Climate Hour website. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.